you for joining us today on Artscape. My name is Beth Iorio. I'm sitting in for Susan Sablon today. I'm to begin the show today with a riddle. What do you get when you combine a painter and a sculptor? Well, we have the answer sitting right here in the studio with us today. Welcome, Robyn, Ryan, to our show.
Oh, thank you. It's very nice to be here.
We're excited to have you, and we have a lot to discuss today, a lot to go through because you brought an enormous amount of work with you. So let's get started. My initial question is, where and how did you begin in the field of art?
Well, I started as a child and sketching, and my teachers would kill me if they knew how much of my notebooks were filled with sketches and things. But my mother took me to an art class she was taking with a National Watercolor Society painter who lived in our neighborhood. And she took me along one day, and they stuck me in the corner and gave me some materials, and she was like, "Oh my." And she let me be her first and youngest child at 8 years old in her children's class on Saturday. So that started probably a 5-6 year stint of solid basics. And
wow, so that was early training you had.
Absolutely.
Now, your mom was in the class. So your mother's also an artist?
I have some other family members who have always been very encouraging and have done artwork, yes.
Very good. So then you take your classes for a couple years. You're a youngster at this point.
Yes.
And then what happened after that? How did you move forward with your artwork and with your talent?
Well, I started selling it, hanging it at the veterinarian's office and
As a
doing
child?
commissions, yeah.
Wow. So you were selling artwork at age?
Oh, probably 11 on.
And you mentioned that you were selling them at a veterinarian shop, medical facility. And why would that be?
Well, because my art teacher at the time it was having to pull teeth to get me to paint anything but animals. So they will always be a favorite subject of mine. So I paint a lot of animals.
Okay, and I think you brought with you today some examples of how your art has progressed over time. Would you like to start?
Sure.
Explain that
Let's
with
put
us?
these two up.
Okay.
Just to show how I work with the animals. I started with a lot of pet portraits, and that's what I would hang in the veterinarian's office. And I have always worked in water media, in watercolor, and just love the spontaneity and the different things that you can do.
And is that because that's how you started? That was what your training was in
Yes,
as a child?
yes. And I was allergic to the fumes with the oils.
Oh, okay. So you stayed with the water medium. All right. And then we have here, who is this a portrait of?
Oh, these are two portraits of my cat named Keister. So.
Very good. All right. And then after this, we progress to?
Well, my other favorite animal is horses. And so I began to work with the horses and riders. And this also shows my fascination with materials. I start using different papers and different things and experimenting a lot, but always with that animal theme.
And I was looking at this one. I think I told you this is one of my favorites. There are many favorites, but this is one of my favorites. It has such a unique look to it. And you said there's a different, it's not actually paper, it's like a plastic
This is actually UPO, which is a plastic paper, and the pigment sits on top. And so you literally move the pigment around versus it being in normal paper, it gets absorbed into the actual fibers of the paper. So this one's a lot of fun as far as technique. You lift a lot of paint off as well as add it on.
And so to begin a project like this, on this type of medium, on this plastic, what do you do? Do you sketch it first, or do you just go straight with the paint?
No, I used to. When I started, I would always draw my painting, draw the design first, but I have actually, especially on the plastic paper that's so easy to move and change, I can erase it with the paint. I don't have to draw it first. And so I have begun to, I don't draw that much now.
Okay, and then my other question on this medium as we switch over to the next one would be, you had mentioned you take off as much as you put on. Is it difficult, though, not to take off too much or to smear it or to even allow it to dry to be in the...
It's funny because people say that watercolor is so difficult, and it really isn't, especially on the plastic paper that's so forgiving. You just add more. Okay. You just add more. And corrections on the regular paper is a little more challenging, but not impossible.
So it is easier to make the changes on the plastic.
And then you can add back on, yes.
Okay, so then we go from that medium to...
This is still water media, but it starts to show, instead of the transparent watercolor, I'm starting to use more opaque. Moving into the gouache and more opaque pigments in watercolor. This also shows how I changed from being very realistic in my painting to starting to become a little more, they call it objective, less objective in the way I handle the subject. But it's funny because I will never let go of my realistic horse form. but I will play and experiment. As you've already seen with the colors that I use, I have a lot of fun with exploring color. And in this particular example, this is one of my early equine shapes paintings, and where I start breaking up the shapes inside of the actual painting.
And that is so unique.
Form.
And what do you call this art form?
This is still just water media. All of my work is in water media.
But I do love how you take the shape and internally, inside the horse, you just manipulate and change.
Absolutely.
And we're going to take a look at other larger portraits, paintings that you've done, which is really quite incredible. Now, is it the same type of paint that you're using? Because there's such a difference between these last two examples that we were looking at.
It's the same paint. It is a matter of how I choose to apply it. Whether I apply it thicker with less water. That's what's so fun about water media. You can treat it very transparently, you can treat it very opaquely.
How do you get the shading?
It's literally a matter of grading the amount of pigment and colors and whatnot.
So do you mix two colors together and then take your brush over to the...
It depends. It depends. Sometimes I will mix the shades on my palette. Sometimes I'll actually mix it on the paper. And you can see in some of the examples that we have hanging where I take advantage of the spontaneity of that wet medium to allow the color to explode inside a given area.
Okay. So. All right. Why don't we take a look at the paintings that we have behind us? Would you like to discuss these a little bit?
Sure.
They're fantastic.
Well, it's kind of an interesting grouping because it has examples from my more realistic works with my locust shade. Yes, I'm very bold with the color in this, but it's still a very realistic form, very modeled shapes and whatnot with the horses. What's interesting is I do landscapes and some other topics, and so I wanted to make sure that I brought an example from my pond series, and it shows how I explore some of the landscape subject matter, but still with the bold colors and different things.
And the pond shape, you have an example of that behind us from that series, correct?
Yes. Okay. Water lilies and dragonfly. From the realistic that you saw, the two cats that we put up, going a little crazy with the colors and the horse that's jumping, there's another painting sitting out in front of us that went from the first equine shapes one to integrating shapes within shapes. And so you have the large horse head in this painting, but you also have the smaller image that you have to kind of search for. If you're not looking for it right away, you have a little challenge, but the front legs of a jumping horse form the eye of the larger horse in this. So I call this series an expansion of equine shapes. I call it the in and out series because you have a large image and then you have the smaller image and the designs intersperse, and so that's why they're named that.
Very good. All right, and before we go to break, could you talk a little bit about the other? I don't think we talked.
We didn't talk about all. I wanted to bring that one up because that was this one was still very flat as far as the shapes are very flat, and I wanted to.
Could you point that? Show.
Well, you have you have a color field that doesn't have any shading within it, doesn't have any modeling within it, so it's just blocks of color shape. That I've used. And so I'd gone from very realistic and modeled and swung the pendulum to getting much more flat.
Okay.
The pendulum started swinging back, and that's what brings us to these two paintings that we have behind us. This is equine shapes in and out on a larger scale, but getting back into the modeling. So some of the horse forms actually start to get a little shadow and shaping.
Oh, that's gorgeous.
And a lot of fun. And then I've become more amorphous even. This actually still has two horse images in it, very similar to the in and out that you saw up front, but it's in a much more subtle fashion, much more mysterious sort of effect.
I hope we can zoom in on this because it is quite unique. Well, I thank you for the first half of the show. I promise you that we have combined a painter and a sculptor, and so when you return to Artscape after the break, you will see Robyn the sculptor next. Thank you.